Welcome, and thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Hinata-Yamaguchi, Project Assistant Professor at the Research Center for Advanced Science and Technology at the University of Tokyo. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this session today with my longtime friend, Dr. Zack Cooper, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, to talk about the Japan-US alliance and the challenges ahead. Just as a logistical note, if you like to ask any questions, please feel free to put it in the Q&A box in Zoom, and I'll handle those accordingly in the second half of the session. Last year at Rolls, we established the Tabletop Exercises project that aims to study the current and future Indo-Pacific security environment and simulate scenarios that will affect the Japan-US alliance and also produce solutions that will help the Japan-US alliance going forward. Today, the Japan-US alliance faces new challenges and uncertainties. Around about this time last year, Zach and I, we held another webinar to talk about the Japan-US alliance, the problems, the challenges, the prospects, and so forth. And while there have been a lot of positive developments since then, there have also been a lot of new developments in the regional security environment and beyond that has become more complex, challenging, and also even threatening. Starting with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the fourth Taiwan crisis in August, and a flurry of North Korean missile launches has taken place for the last year and a half or so. So I thought it's fitting for us to talk not only about how things have become more challenging, but what is being done and what could or should be done going forward in light of the myriad problems that we face today. And so this is really becoming an annual event, to invite Dr. Zack Cooper in. Again, like Zach and I, we go back a long way, like I think 12 years now. And so Dr. Zack Cooper is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, also teaches at Princeton University, and co-hosts the Net Assessment podcast for War on the Rocks, which is highly recommended for anyone here. Zach has published and presented extensively on U.S. and Indo-Pacific security issues, and is one of the most influential strategists in the United States, which is why I thought, he is the perfect person to invite for this occasion. And again, this is becoming an annual event, so we will see more of Zach going forward through webinars and hopefully in-person events now that it's easier to travel and so forth. So Zach, welcome back, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks, Rio. It's wonderful to be back with you and really looking forward to the discussion today.
Cheers. Okay, so Zach, let's start things off right away. And so the first thing that we need to sort of cover is how's the security environment, whether it just be in the Pacific region or even beyond, how's the security environment changing for the Japan-US alliance?
I think the security environment is bad. And that's the place to start. It's worse than it's been probably maybe for Japan in my lifetime. We know that Japan has really three primary security concerns, right? China, North Korea, and Russia. And each one of them is posing lots of problems today that they haven't posed, at least in the recent past, right? Obviously, we've seen China not just with its military buildup over many decades, but increasingly over the last few years, being much more active in coercive practices against Japan, but against others as well, right? Everything from military coercion to the use of Coast Guard vessels and maritime militia, and the use of economic tools against US allies. Japan has obviously been targeted over the Senkakus, but this has happened now to South Korea, to Australia, to many friends in Europe as well. So I think if you just look at the China issue, that is probably more severe now than it's ever been. And I know we'll talk a lot more about Taiwan, but I think since Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan last August, my sense is that friends in Tokyo have really become more tuned to the challenge that we are all facing from China. So that's worse. I think the situation with North Korea, as you know well, is quite serious, right? We know that North Korea is continuing to build up its nuclear and its missile programs. We keep waiting for this next nuclear test, which we know is probably coming at some point. And so North Korea's nuclear buildup is continuing, as it has been for quite some time. And then we've got Russia also, obviously going to war in Ukraine, but doing lots of nuclear posturing and other things, some targeted at Japan, but much targeted at Europe. But I think if I was sitting in Tokyo looking at my three main security concerns, I'd be pretty concerned because I think all three of them are creating problems that they haven't created in the past.
Right. And so on that point, okay, whenever we talk about the Indo-Pacific, security environment and so forth, we always come up with the same thing, and that's the three-letter word bad, right, or worse, or more challenging, whatever, right? We can come up with all sorts of adjectives, but mostly negative. Now, we have seen these problems in the past, right? I mean, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, right? When we were still young, we're still young. But back then, we were still talking about roughly similar things, right? The threats from China, North Korea, and maybe to a lesser extent Russia, but still, is roughly the same, right? The question here is it more of what we've seen before, like, 10, 12 years ago when we first, when we were like, in like young leaders meetings and all that, or are we still seeing new trends, right? I mean, there's like a new direction that we're sort of heading into or witnessing right now?
I think there is a new trend, and this may be something that's more new in Tokyo than it is in Washington. But my sense from talking to many Japanese friends over many years is that there tended to be a perception that an actual major conflict, right, a big war involving great powers, was very unlikely. Not impossible, but very unlikely, at least in the near term. And I think that bubble has been popped. It was popped by Russia a year ago when it invaded Ukraine. But I think, 6 months later, China's reaction to Nancy Pelosi's visit, I think that reminded many in Asia that this could happen in Asia too. So I think that's new. Right. It's not that the challenge from North Korea is new. It's worse, but it's not fundamentally new. It's not that the challenge from Russia in Asia is fundamentally new. But I think this realization that a major conflict potentially involving China, Taiwan, could happen in the next number of years, that to me seems to be a big change. And I think it's driving a lot of the changes in Washington and Tokyo and elsewhere.
Right. And so, we often refer to the effects, maybe effects or whatever, China's military exercise in August last year. I think that definitely alerted a lot of people here in Japan, not simply because of, how aggressive China got, but more so because, like, when we look at exactly how those exercises took place, we sort of saw the contours or like a rough sort of sketch about what China could do, right? It's not like just simply like throwing things in the air or whatever, right? We saw like parts of the naval blockade, some strikes, and some of those strikes, again, were entering like, Japan's EEZ and so forth, right? Extremely close. But we at least saw that sort of rough contours of the, the outline of what China could do, right? And obviously it's going to be a lot more sophisticated and more lethal, right? If they get real, that's one thing. And North Korea, we see them getting into tactical nukes, right? Diversifying their arsenals, and they're operationalizing that. We see a lot of developments in C2 and all of that. And China, again, sort of going back and forth, they're learning a lot of lessons from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and a lot of things that Russia's not doing right. Okay, and so I don't go with the argument that the Ukraine crisis is connected to the Taiwan crisis so much, because they're two separate things. But I do see China strengthening itself in various ways, right? And that this could be a whole webinar in itself, by learning from the lessons that they're getting from our Russia's operations in Ukraine. And so yeah, I completely agree that we see new trends, and obviously, if we want to throw in like economic security issues and cyber and all that, then we're busting open a whole can of worms, and that will this can be like a 4-hour webinar, right? But yeah, so, but again, like there's also a side of me that tells me that, these are things that we could have picked up a long time ago. And when you talked about how things are more challenging in Japan, I agree with you completely on this, right? But I also think that that's also like a perception issue that's sort of self-imposed or self-inflicted, right? And so, but what about in the United States? I mean, is there any changes in the way the United States perceives some of these new security developments or challenges?
I do think there's been a big change in the United States, and I think it all relates to China. And even though people won't frame it quite this way, I think for many people in Washington, the most important factor has been that it looks like everything is pointing towards a really serious disagreement over Taiwan. And what has made this even more serious is the fact that China has taken away any hope for peaceful reconciliation with Taiwan. What the leadership in Beijing, I think, has long wished for is that people in Taiwan would decide that they want to be part of mainland China and the Chinese Communist Party, and that China and Taiwan would unify, or as the Communist Party would say, reunify. And what's happened, right, is that basically the Communist Party's actions in Hong Kong have convinced most people in Taiwan that actually this one party, two systems model is not real and it wouldn't work for Taiwan. And so even though I think few Americans think of the Taiwan situation through that lens, the reason it's so critical is that for a long time, the United States sort of hoped that we could eventually come up with some solution to the Taiwan issue that would not require a conflict, right? And one of the possible solutions was that the Chinese would either, merge with Taiwan, or that they would be so comfortable with the direction the relationship was going that they wouldn't actually decide to take military action. I think now the risk is that many people in the United States are looking at China and Taiwan, and it looks like there's either the Chinese are going to push hard on Taiwan because they want to get it back, or they're going to be deterred by actions that the US and Taiwan and Japan take. But it looks like those are the only two options. And so I think for many Americans, this has really focused our attention on the Taiwan issue. And as I said, I think a big reason that that's the case is because this hope or expectation that some people had that Taiwan would come off of the agenda and that there would be a one party, two systems, one country, two systems model, that's gone away. So I think that's been the biggest change in Washington.
Right. And also, like, when it comes to sort of perceptions in the United States, particularly Washington, I think one of the things that we learned for last month or so came from, well, balloons, right? Which threw both of us around, in a fairly bizarre, unexpected way, right? I still get missiles about moment, and then I get, pulled into the interviews and consultations about like balloons that I didn't even think about for a while, right? But one thing that I was struck by was the extent of the reactions in the United States, right? Now, I'm not saying that, it's bizarre. It's not, right? I mean, I'll feel threatened as well. But I have a feeling that, like, the reactions that we saw, particularly from politicians in the United States and also public opinion, right, may be so beyond what even China may have expected in some ways. I'm not sure, right? We can talk about this forever. And so do we see like something new sort of being busted open in the United States, like, in terms of perceptions, right? Vis-a-vis China after the sort of the balloon incident cases, whatever we want to call it?
Yeah, I think there are two lessons that I take away from the balloon crisis. The first is that in the United States, issues related to China are just deeply political now. And that we're going to see these kinds of reactions from Washington on China issues for the foreseeable future, because the one thing that both Democrats and Republicans can agree on is that they're worried about China. And so when there's a balloon that seems to be over the US homeland doing something strange, it's going to get a lot of attention in the United States, maybe more than people would have thought that it merited. As a quick aside, I would say this probably got more attention than it would have because the Biden team was a little slow to act on the balloon. If they had shot it down very quickly, I don't think it would have gotten several weeks of media attention. It would have been a little issue and then it would have gone away. But they were a bit slow to react. And that's part of why it became such a big issue. But look, China is going to be just deeply political now in the US system for the foreseeable future. And I don't think that's going to change. And I think many in Beijing are probably surprised by the level of concern that something small like the balloon created in Washington.
Right.
The second lesson for me, though, just real quick, is the windows for the US and China to try and stabilize the bilateral relationship are really small. So I had thought that there would be a window from when Xi Jinping and Joe Biden met last fall up until maybe in the middle of this summer in the United States. So maybe from like December of 2022 to, let's say, July or August of 2023, right? 6, 7, 8 months of time where maybe the US and China could have some meetings and try and stabilize the bilateral relationship. What the balloon has done is it delayed the ability of Tony Blinken to go to Beijing. And as a result, it's delaying any real cooperation or efforts to even stabilize the US-China bilateral relationship by a couple of months. And you might say, well, why do those few months matter? Well, they matter because China is such a political issue in Washington that you can't make any progress on the bilateral relationship in the middle of an election cycle. And we're heading into a presidential election cycle that's going to heat up in the fall. So the balloon crisis has taken away maybe 2 months, 3 months of time where you could have stabilized the relationship. And I think there only were maybe 6, 7, 8 months to begin with. So in other words, I think what we're seeing is that China is an inherently political issue in Washington, but we're only going to see some very small windows to try and stabilize the bilateral relationship. And very small things are going to be able to throw the relationship back off kilter in those windows. And so that's part of why I think the US-China relationship in particular is in a really difficult spot. And I doubt it's going to get better anytime soon.
Right. And just to add to that, this is really connected to what you just said, is that I think one of the other key takeaways is that I was shocked, or I should say reminded, about the lack of or shortage of exit strategies, out of this crisis as well. I mean, that's also nothing, right? It's not just about the opportunities of dialogue, but also just the exit strategies to getting out of this mess. Right now, of course, it's all on China because they're the ones that launched these things in the first place, right? But I felt that maybe it's not just a Biden administration thing, right? But there's a lack of options or shortage of options and also exit strategies in dealing with crises like this, right? And so yeah, I'm not optimistic. I mean, just like how you and I grew up with the Soviet thing when we were kids, right? My feel is that our kids, right, are going to grow up in that sort of similar mindset, right? But maybe in a more complex way going forward, for them as they grow up in that. So that's definitely something that we do have to think about now. So, okay, so the security environment, it's changed in a lot of bad ways. And again, as you said, we saw new trends that have unfolded and all that, which means that we do need to sort of align ourselves or reconfigure ourselves to those new trends and challenges. And this is pretty much what we talked about last year when we had this webinar, is that, things are going to get rough, things are going to get more complex, and that, we wrote down, talked the list of things that Japan and US should do, right, individually and also as an alliance and all of that. But again, a lot of things happened negatively in the environment, but a lot of positive things happened too, right, in Japan, United States, and also between us in that alliance package. But so what have been some of the key developments in Japan US alliance over the past year? Okay, in Japan, we have the national security strategy, national defense strategy, and defense program that came out late last year. In the United States, we have the national security strategy, of course, but the Indo-Pacific strategy that came out roughly at the same time when we did that webinar, and also nuclear posture review, and also I'm sure many others as well. So if we first start with those two, the developments that took place in Japan and US, and we can pull this apart, what were some of the takeaways that you have from those?
Well, first, I think there's a lot of alignment between America's strategy and Japan's strategy, and that's great news, I think, from an alliance perspective. If you read the two national security strategies, you're going to see a lot of similarities. It's not that it's a perfect overlap, but in general, I think the US-Japan alliance is probably in its strongest position, maybe since I've been working on the alliance. And so that's great news. I do think there were some differences between Japan's approach in the national security strategy and the American version. So let me just highlight three of those, which I think are going to be a little bit tricky moving forward. So the first is economics, right? And I think you know this well. At the end of the day, Japan has been a pretty active economic player throughout the Indo-Pacific region for quite a long time. It's taken on this leadership role in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, pushing through CPTPP. The United States is a little bit lost on economics in Asia. We don't appear to have a trade strategy. We don't have one under Biden, and I don't think we had one under Trump. And Japan has tried to pick up the ball and run with it, but the reality is that Japan is able to do a lot on its own. But Washington, it needs to come up with some real economic strategy, and I don't think the Indo-Pacific economic framework is going to do it. So that's the first difference I see in the strategies, right? Japan is really forward-leaning on trade, and the United States is not. The second issue, which I worry about, is a difference on narratives. So when I read not just Japan's national security strategy, but what Prime Minister Kishida said when he came to Washington, he spoke at Johns Hopkins University here, and much of his speech was about how we need to be appealing to other countries, not just large industrial democracies, but also the global South, right? And have a narrative that appeals to those countries. And I think he's right. The narrative that the US has in our national security strategy is really the core narrative is about democracies and autocracies being locked in a struggle, right? And Joe Biden says that we need to win that struggle. Well, I think a lot of countries don't want to be in the middle of a struggle between democracies and autocracies. You know, of course, a lot of America's closest allies are big, important democracies like Japan and Korea and Australia and our friends in Europe. But we've got a lot of partners and some allies as well that are not democratic. And we've got a lot of democratic friends that don't want to be caught in the struggle between democracies and autocracies. So I think the second challenge we have is one of narratives. And frankly, I'm with Japan again on this issue, that I think Japan's narratives have been a bit more artful than those of the United States. And I think we could learn something from Tokyo in this regard. And then the last issue, which I would just highlight, is that I think there's a little bit of a resourcing challenge in both countries. We're certainly seeing it in Japan. I am incredibly impressed that the Kishida administration is putting forward substantial defense budget increases. And I think it is important, it is merited, and it's going to be very hard, right? We all know how hard it will be to raise taxes. My guess, and you'll know this again better than I will, is that there's a pretty good chance that Japan will finance defense spending through debt. I think at the end of the day, more defense spending right now is really critical. So that may be the choice that Japan has to make. But I think we're also having a resourcing debate in Washington about our own defense spending. Republicans, for the first time in my memory, are suggesting cutting the defense budget by a substantial amount. This is what House Republicans negotiated with Speaker McCarthy in order to give him the speakership. And you know, the Biden team, I think, is struggling to figure out what this all means and how to situate themselves. And obviously, we do have pressing global requirements. It's not 100% Asia for the United States. And in particular, you know, what we're doing in Ukraine, I think, is a pretty wise use of resources, but it's not inexpensive. And so the third area where I'm a bit concerned is the resources that both countries have to bring to bear on these challenges. But overall, I would just say, I'm hugely impressed by what Japan did in its national security strategy, in its defense strategy, in the Buildup Program. I think these are big steps. And my final comment on this is many people that study Japan in the United States and many Japanese friends as well have always said, oh, look, these steps that Japan is taking, they're very small, they're evolutionary. We shouldn't describe them as big steps because they're really just small changes. I think what we've seen from Japan in the last year and even the last few months, the documents, the 2+2 statement, I think these are big generational type steps that we're going to look back on and appreciate just how hard these things were to do.
Yeah. And you raise a lot of great points there. And I think you also led some new questions as well. So so we know what the developments are. You read documents, and again, there's a lot of things that were positive. There's 3 security documents that came out from Japan. Well, it addressed a lot of things that we pointed out last year, right? Not just like counterstrike. I mean, counterstrike is important, right? But it's just one part of it. I mean, there were a lot of other critical things in there, like joint commands, logistics, all these great things in there. But obviously, and also in the United States, we see we can debate this, of course, right? But I don't feel negative about what's going on in the United States in terms of strategy. I'm not that worried. And at least from Japan-US alliance perspective, again, I think 2022, 2023, things are very different, right? And I'm more sure now in 2023 as opposed to 2022, 2021. But obviously, there's a lot of things that are left unaddressed and a lot of challenges, as you said, right? Thinking about values, I think that's a very good point. And you talked about it quite often in a net assessment podcast. Is this about ideology? Is this about values? That's again a whole debate itself. Economic issues, well, and these economic issues, these things haunt us, right? Regardless of what era we're living in. But about resourcing, right? That's always the tricky one, right? Because it's always easy for us to be noisy about resourcing. Again, defense budget increase that's important, right? And I feel good about that in many ways, that we are increasing defense budget here in Japan. Although I'm surprised about the developments over in the United States. But it's not so much about how much is being increased. It's about how you spend it. I mean, that's what really matters in defense spending, right? And so when we talk about resourcing, one of my concerns is that we're increasing defense budget, but we're still spending it in bad ways. A lot of it's going to boil down to the defense planning itself, right? And so one of the problems I find is that, well, many of the things outlined in the national security strategy, the defense plans, and all that on both sides, right? Japan and the United States, while they're critical and long overdue, there are concerns over the bandwidth to effectively and efficiently implement and operationalize these things, right? Because these things ain't like, it's not like us picking up something at the groceries, right? These are things that are going to take years and years and years, right? And so when we connect that to the resourcing factor, isn't that something that we have to think about? Whether it be, well, particularly for Japan, but also for the United States?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. I think there is a bandwidth issue. And look, it's going to be a problem in Tokyo, in part because Japan's trying to do so much all at the same time. It's going to be a problem in the United States, right? We see the Biden administration, I think, in the last few months making really good progress in a couple of areas. We've got the 2+2 with Japan in January. We've got an agreement with the Philippines in February about gaining access to 4 more facilities in the Philippines for the U.S. forces. We've got a likely US, Australia, UK meeting in the next couple of weeks in March. We've got agreements with the Pacific Island states, the 3 compact members, over the compact agreements. Those are going to come in the spring as well. So I think if you step back and you look at everything that the Biden team is trying to do, there's a lot on the table. And there is a bandwidth challenge, right? There's a bandwidth challenge, not just because of the Ukraine issue, but even within Asia, right? There's only so much time that our officials have, and the same is true for Tokyo. So I think at the end of the day, what this means is that we're going to have to make some priorities. And it doesn't mean that we're going to avoid doing anything in certain areas, but some places are not going to be the top priority for the United States or for Japan moving forward. And I think the one area that is not quite clear to me yet is where the Biden administration is going to put those priorities. We've said we're prioritizing the Pacific Islands. We're prioritizing the Quad. We're prioritizing ASEAN. We're prioritizing US-China relations. We're prioritizing US relations with Korea, right? Obviously, right now, we're prioritizing Taiwan. At the end of the day, though, if you prioritize the entire region, you're actually not prioritizing at all. And I think as a result, what we've seen is the Biden team sometimes jumping from one issue to another and not quite focusing enough time and attention on the top priorities. So I think that's going to be the big challenge for Washington in the last 2 years of the Biden administration, at least in its first term, is to figure out where do they want to focus on execution. And for me, I would say, look, the US-Japan alliance is making a lot of progress. So there's an argument to be made that this is the time to really focus on implementing what we've agreed to and getting that right. The small danger that I'll note there is that if they do that and they really focus on execution and implementation, there's a danger that I think we won't be thinking forward about the other things that the alliance still needs to have on the agenda. And I think there are some things that should be on the alliance agenda that aren't yet at the top of the priority list. So I think this is going to be a really big challenge over the next couple of years.
Yeah, and when it comes to defense plans or national security plans and all sorts, I think from the alliance perspective, and you and I, we've been talking about Japan-US alliance for many, many years now, that I think we always need to remind ourselves that while we may have good defense plans or interesting defense plans or positive defense plans, whatever, in each of our countries, there is sometimes a difference with things that are positive for the alliance, right? I mean, there are, if Japan acquires certain weapons that's good for the self-defense force, again, we have to contextualize that because, things that may be good for the ground self-defense force or air self-defense force or maritime self-defense force, they may be good for those branches, but may not necessarily help from the viewpoint of joint operations and all that. That's vital for the defense of Japan overall, right? And likewise, things that may be good for Japan or the United States may not necessarily be good for the Japan-US alliance, right? Are you worried about that factor? I mean, that's something that I've always been worried about, throughout my career so far, right? But is there anything that comes to mind in that context now that you talked about resourcing and defense plans and so forth and prioritization?
Yeah, so the area that I worry about with that is I think we're entering sort of a new model of the US-Japan alliance, right? We've always talked about Japan as the shield and the United States as the spear, right? So Japan sort of protects the alliance, and when needed, the United States comes in and has striking power. But let's be honest, that's changing, right? We're seeing Japan pick up the spear, at least a little bit, and be prepared to use it. So I think the big challenge from an alliance perspective, therefore, is roles and missions and capabilities. And we need to have a very clear understanding of what the United States is doing and what we should be doing, but also, how does counterstrike change what US roles should be, right? Does that mean that the US needs less ability to do strikes? Probably not, right? But I don't think we've had a careful debate, at least that I've been part of, about exactly what counterstrike means for the US and Japan for how we're going to divide up certain mission sets, right? And there is a risk, of course, that as Japan becomes more capable, it's the self-defense forces become more capable, that they basically copy a lot of the capabilities that the United States already has, right? They duplicate capabilities. And I think that would be a shame, right? Because we only have so many resources, and there are some areas where we just need capacity, right? We need more systems. But there are others where I think if Japan did the same thing the US is already doing, that would be essentially wasting resources from an alliance perspective. And so this is one area that I think we probably need to do a lot more work on, is understanding which areas is the alliance underinvested in. And are there areas where we're both investing in things, but we don't need to have both of us really putting a lot of resources into an area? So let me just highlight one where I think we're dramatically underinvested, which is munitions. So if we've learned anything from watching the war in Ukraine, right, it's that Ukraine is going through tremendous numbers of munitions. And if we were in a major contingency in East Asia, right, it would be using far more munitions and more high-end munitions than what Ukraine has been going through. And neither the United States nor Japan have the magazine depth. We don't have enough of those kinds of weapons and munitions. And we don't have the industrial bases to build them fast enough if we started running through them. So for me, if I was stepping back and looking at alliance roles and capabilities, I would say, look, we should target the areas where we think we've got a gap. And the big gap for me is in munitions. I think the US is dramatically underinvested in this area for years and years and years. And Japan has sort of followed our lead as well. So that would be an area that I think we're going to have a lot of work to do.
Yeah. And when we talk about defense plans and strengthening the forces and alliances and so forth, it's always easy to first to get into that sort of fantasy baseball attitude, right? And say we want this, we want that. But as said, capabilities does not necessarily mean effective, does not always reflect effectiveness. Right. And to get effectiveness, we need to get our priorities right, and we need to get the logistics right. I mean, that's really the thing that is going to make us effective. It's not just the weapons that we have or the assets that we have, but the things that we need to get those, to use those assets, mobilize them, and execute them, for the missions that are most critical. Counter-strike again is an aspect, right? But not the aspect necessarily. That's why I'll push for asymmetric operations and so forth, to sort of get that yin-yang combination going between Japan and the United States. That's what we really need to make the alliance effective. But so again, a lot, there's again a lot of positive developments, but also a lot of homework or things that we still need to work on going forward. But obviously, it's going to be about, well, what are we working for? What do we, why do we need to do things? And that's where we come back to thinking about some new challenges. And so what are the key agendas for the Japan-US alliance, regarding, obviously, the Korean Peninsula? We sort of get an understanding about how to deal with them. Okay, yeah, North Korea is becoming more of a threat because of the assets they have, but we're fairly familiar with how to deal with North Korea, although we need to sort of improve it, but we get a general sense. China and Taiwan, however, is a whole different ball game, right? Things are changing rapidly, and it will, and the impact is also very uncertain as well, right? The extent of it, and that depends a lot on how we handle it. And so, the question is, what can and should the United States and Japan do to effectively prevent or respond to a Taiwan crisis that we are much more aware of now, as well as, this was the potential simultaneous crisis on the Korean Peninsula or even South China Sea, right? Again, there's a lot of things that we can talk about here, but let's get one thing straight on this, is that when we talk about Taiwan, and we talk about Taiwan all the time, right, and Japan-US alliance is really looking at this problem now, but we often get misconceptualized about, what all of this is about. First, does Japan and the United States see eye to eye on the security of Taiwan? What do you feel about that? It's just your gut feeling.
I think we do increasingly. You and I have had this conversation for many years, but I think 5 or 10 years ago, if an American went to Tokyo and said, I want to talk about Taiwan scenarios, you would get a lot of nervousness out of Japanese friends in government, maybe even in the expert community. Certainly if you went up to the Diet, you would just get people saying, well, maybe we should do this quietly. Let's not be too open about this. Now my experience is I have to stop my Japanese friends from talking about Taiwan all the time. This has been a very rapid transformation, and I think for good reason, right? The fact that China is firing missiles into Japan's exclusive economic zone, that focuses the mind on the challenge of Taiwan contingency. So look, it's not that the US and Japan are perfectly aligned on Taiwan issues. We have different policies, right? The US one China policy is a little bit different than Japan's policy. But in general, I think our baseline approach is the same, which is we want to maintain the status quo. And we're both worried that deterrence is eroding. And so I think both the US and Japan are looking for ways to stabilize that military balance. And for me, this has been a really rapid change in the alliance that, something that we couldn't talk about just a few years ago now is focusing the alliance in a way that I've never seen before. I suggested a few months ago that I thought that this was essentially Japan coming to terms with the fact that it has to be ready for a contingency, a real contingency. And I think it's triggering some changes in Tokyo that basically are forcing Japan to think about not just the general idea of having more capabilities on the military side, but actually what would warfighting require, right? It's making command and control arrangements change. It's making political discussions about Taiwan with the public become more important. These kinds of things, I think, weren't happening before. And I think that's all attributable to the alignment that we have in seeing the risk around Taiwan.
Yeah. And, you sort of talked about how we want to sort of maintain the status quo and sort of protect that. But there's, again, always this question about, what is our strategy on Taiwan anyway? And that's something that we always need to think about because I think it's easy for us to say, yeah, we need to make sure that Taiwan's secure, but we need to think about the why and how question, right? That's something that we do always need to answer because that's something that I think we always miss, right? And here, are we talking about, let's say, the US and Japan defending Taiwan on their behalf, or are we seeking to work with Taiwan for some kind of, trilateral effort against China, or are we simply just trying to stop a spillover effect, right? That will affect, let's say, Japan's security. So again, we can talk about this forever, but what's your feeling on this? Just general feeling on this.
So I don't think that we should be focused on trying to keep Taiwan and China apart, right? That to me, it would be a mistaken policy. There are some people who would advocate that and who think that Taiwan should declare independence and the US should support that. Some American politicians have even said this. I think that's the wrong approach. I think the right approach is to say, look, the people on Taiwan should get to be the primary ones determining their future.
Right.
That doesn't mean that the right thing for them is to declare formal de jure independence, right? Because I think, in fact, that at the moment would probably lead to a conflict. But it does mean that I think from an American perspective and a Japanese perspective, the right approach on Taiwan is not to just to worry about the spillover effects that this might have on Japan, but is to actually worry about the fact that there are 23 million people in Taiwan. And that, in my view, they should have a say over what happens with their future. And the US is committed not to formally defend Taiwan as we used to under the US-Taiwan Mutual Defense Treaty, but we have committed to provide Taiwan with arms to defend itself and to maintain our capability to defend Taiwan should that be required. And, my view is that if China crosses the line and tries to use force to unify Taiwan with the mainland, I think the US should intervene, and I think it would probably require Japan to intervene as well. In part because what we're really trying to stand up for are these basic rules and norms about how countries should treat one another. And I think if that core rule gets broken in the Taiwan situation, it's pretty hard to understand how we could push back anywhere else in East Asia convincingly, right? And so, if I was sitting in Ishigaki or Yonaguni and thinking about the prospect of China forcibly taking Taiwan, that would make me quite nervous, right?
Right.
And so I think from an alliance perspective, we shouldn't just think about the effects on Japan, but I think we have to think about the broader regional effects. And so for me, that means we need to maintain a deterrent capability that persuades China not to take large-scale military action against Taiwan.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And we also often hear about what we should do with Taiwan, right?
Yeah.
And that's always a tricky question because political sensitivities and nature of the relationship, and so forth. But so working with Taiwan, that's one issue. But we also need to think about sort of how we can work with other states as well, right? And I think one country that's going to be vital here when we think about sort of possible contingency in Taiwan Strait is the Philippines, for example. And we do a lot, in our career, in our job, we do a lot of tabletop exercise, wargaming, and all that kind of stuff. And we often see now a lot of attention to some kind of simultaneous situation. And we talk about this in media and also in academic writings as well. It's like, would there be some kind of simultaneous crisis in Taiwan Straits and in Korean Peninsula? Or the problem here is that it's not simply for the fact that all hell breaks loose here. And it's almost like what we see in some of those games that we used to play like when we were kids, right? But also what haunts me about this is how we can actually go about it. When we have such a situation, with issues such as how to coordinate the US, Japan, and US ROK alliances, right? That's one, and also with other allies and like-minded states, but also capacity. Because my fear is that if we have a situation like that, right, there's going to be a lot of capacity issues that we do have to think about, not just munitions, but many others. Now, again, I don't want us to go too deep into simultaneous thing because we can break this up into various things, let's say China attacking or invading Taiwan, and then North Korea taking advantage of that, or China. So depending on North Korea to do something to distract the alliances, and then taking Taiwan in midst of that, or even the other way around. Although maybe this is a little bit harder or more challenging for the Chinese case, for China, but China taking advantage of some kind of contingency on the Korean Peninsula, right? Whatever it is, there's a constellation of scenarios out there. But when we think about that, it's a kind of nightmare scenario. Although I know I'm sort of pushing things out a little bit. Isn't this where we have to think about, one, again, our priorities, but also how we can maybe be a little bit more innovative about the alliance network?
Yeah, I think this is a real challenge. And, this is certainly something that's getting a lot of attention in Washington right now, with some people saying, oh, the US has to make priorities and it shouldn't do anything on Ukraine because our only priority should be China. And some people are then worrying about, well, what happens if you have to fight Russia and China at the same time? Look, my view on this is pretty simple, which is that we have to prioritize the contingencies that we think are most important and where US help is needed most urgently. And when I look around the world and I think, let's talk about just three challenges right now, the three we talked about at the start, right? Russia, North Korea, and China. I look at those three and I think China's priority number one, and it's not close. And so if we're in a major contingency with China, that's going to have to be the US focus, period. And you know what? There's some good news on this, which is that South Korea is incredibly capable, as you know well. The South Korean military is far more capable than the North, which doesn't mean that the North can't do tremendous damage, right? It has nuclear weapons. It has tens of thousands of artillery tubes, many within range of Seoul. So this is a very serious contingency, but it's also one where the 28,500 US forces in Korea plus South Korean forces themselves should be capable of prevailing ultimately in the conventional military fight. And just like, frankly, in Europe, at the moment, I think it is hard to imagine the Russian military beating NATO in a conventional force-on-force fight. And again, that is also largely a ground fight with a substantial air component. And so for me, the good news here is that North Korea is not as strong as South Korea, and Russia is not as strong as it used to be. And NATO at some point is going to increase its capabilities and step up a bit more in Europe, at least. So if I had to prioritize and we were in the midst of contingencies with North Korea and Russia and China, as an American, my priority would be to deal with the China challenge first. Which is not to say we wouldn't do anything about North Korea or Russia, but it's to say you've got to make sure that you address the most serious challenge and the one where US forces are needed, and you do that as the top priority. This is a little bit in the reverse of what the US did in World War II, right? Where we had a Europe first strategy, and the strategy was to beat Germany and then to beat Japan. I think essentially what you're seeing from the United States is for a long time, if you were to ask an American what our top strategic theaters were, they were, Europe, and then maybe the Middle East, and then maybe Asia. And now this is changing. The US national security strategy makes pretty clear that China is the pacing challenge. And I think in that context, if you think China is the pacing challenge, then you have to think that the key theater is the Indo-Pacific region, and the key ally or the pacing ally is Japan. So for me, if we were stressed with multiple contingencies, I think the US would double down on the US-Japan alliance, and we'd double down on making sure that we could manage the challenge from China.
Yeah. Again, but still, I think you point to something that's really important, is that I'm also confident that, we have the capabilities that are able, theoretically, that are stronger than adversaries and competitors. At the same time, still there's a capacity thing, right? And that's the thing that's really going to determine the outcome in the end, and also the level of effectiveness. Now, going back a little bit to what we discussed earlier, my other concern is that, for example, the national security strategy in Japan, the defense strategy, and defense plans and so forth. When I look at those three documents from the Japanese side, okay, I'm more confident about Japan's ability to operate and mobilize and operate better or more effectively in sort of war fighting. But one thing I'm still horned by is gray zone situations that sort of chip away at the status quo. Now, okay, gray zone situations, it's a gray zone situation if you think it's a gray zone situation. It's really, it's a really subjective argument here, right? But still, I see gray zone situations taking place all the time, right? It's taking place as we are doing this webinar right now, right? With Taiwan Straits, East China Sea, South China Sea, the Korean Peninsula, right? Is that something that we have to do more of, right? To deal with those gray zone situations so that we can deter from this high-end conflicts in the first place. Because again, we're sort of jumping to high-end conflicts and contingencies, but isn't something that we need to do in the meantime? Because it's a bit of a gradient there, right? What do you think?
Yeah, so for me, the top priority should be to deter the high-end conflict, but I think it would be a mistake to assume that the lower level gray zone situations can just be dealt with as long as you prepare for high-end conflict, because I think a lot of the capabilities are different, right? So let me just give you one simple example related to Taiwan, which is the easiest way for the United States and Japan and Taiwan to stop a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would be to sink the amphibious vessels that would transport the invasion force onto Taiwan's beaches, right? If, however, China does another kind of gray zone activity, let's say a blockade, the kinds of capabilities we would need to break a blockade might be very, very different, right? We might be doing convoy operations instead of trying to shoot Chinese ships with anti-ship missiles and mines and the like. So I don't think we can treat those cases as simply lesser included cases in these larger contingencies. Now, the big lesson I would take away from what Japan and the US have done in gray zone situations is that I think we can actually deter China when we're really serious. So I look back, for example, at the 2010-2012 period and the increasing pressure that China was putting on Japan over the Senkaku Islands, right? And as you may remember well, in 2014, Barack Obama came out and he said, look, basically, we're going to apply the US-Japan Security Treaty to the Senkaku Islands because they are administered by Japan. He was explicit about this. And it's not that China backed off from all of its challenges in the Senkakus, but we didn't see that continued escalation that we'd seen in 2010 and 2012. And China sort of settled for an uneasy, steady state. So I think that has to be one of the big lessons that we should take away from this, which is that actually when the US has tried to deter in the gray zone, and it's tried hard, China has sometimes backed away. It's decided that this just isn't an issue worth really challenging, right? I mean, 10 years ago, we would have been talking this whole hour about the East China Sea. And now this is basically the first time it's come up. So I think there are times that we can be very effective in gray zones, but what we have to do is demonstrate that the gray zone activity is something we are really caring about enough to draw a clear red line and to stand by that red line. The United States and Japan did that in 2014, but we haven't done that on South China Sea issues, for example, right? And we've been pretty nervous about drawing clear red lines on Taiwan as well, for good reason. And so I think we shouldn't be surprised that we're seeing China continue to push in those areas where we've not been willing to do what we did with Japan almost a decade ago now.
Yeah. And yeah, I'm so starting to sound like a broken record, but it's really about how we can go about it more effectively this time around, right? And yeah, we can come up with a whole list. Right. You and I are really good at sort of prescribing things, but like logistics, munitions, but also some more updated concept operations, doctrines and so forth, not just as individual countries, but also as an alliance. And is somehow ideally link that with those of the CONOPS and doctrines of US Rock Alliance, here's Australia, and so I want that sort of network going on, so multilateral thing, because that's what we need, particularly when we think about that possibility of a simultaneous conflict or contingency, Korean Peninsula, Taiwan Straits, or South China Sea, wherever else, and again, when we start talking about simultaneous contingencies, I have people saying to me, look, you're going to extremes, right? You start to sound like some kind of novelist or something. But the reality is that we have simultaneous gray zone situations taking place in this area, right? And so that's, I think, something that we do, need to think about, going forward. Now, okay, so just before we go into, Q&A, obviously, we do need to think about how we can sort of better some network, the U.S. U.S. alliance, and also like-minded states, right? Japan, Korea, and so forth. We often talk about Japan and Korea, but are there any other states that you think need some kind of enhancing to this relationship? Now we can talk about Australia, of course, right? But any others?
Well, when I look at what we're doing in the Asia Pacific I think you're exactly right. Like the US-Japan Korea relationship to me is one where there's still a lot of room. Obviously, it's not easy to make progress when Seoul and Tokyo are involved, but just look at what President Yoon said a few days ago about Japan. Some pretty positive comments, right? I think it's not going to be easy, but I think the door is open for some deeper cooperation between the US and Japan and Korea. So one thing that I've been pushing for quite some time is when I step back and I ask, what's an area that would be ripe for cooperation between those three? I keep coming back to extended deterrence, right? So right now, the US has extended deterrence dialogues with Japan and with Korea separately. But I think increasingly, we're worried about similar challenges. We're worried about North Korea. We're worried about China. And so I think it will make sense over time to start having some of those discussions on a trilateral basis, or even a quadrilateral basis, right? With maybe Australia included, so that Japan and South Korea and Australia understand what US policy is on extended deterrence, how we use nuclear weapons to signal to China, to North Korea, to Russia. If we were in a real crisis, what would happen with those nuclear capabilities? What would our initial steps be up the escalation ladder? And I think that's going to be necessary in part because, as you know very well, South Korea is having a real debate about the virtues of nuclear weapons. And I think it would be a shame if we didn't use this as an opportunity to try and not just deepen the US-South Korea alliance, but to deepen cooperation between our key allies in the region, all of whom have nervousness about nuclear issues. So if I had to pick one area where I think there could be some cooperation on a trilateral or a quadrilateral basis, I think that would be the top priority in the defense realm for me.
Yeah, and I'm actually going to connect this with a question that's just popped up from a person in the audience. Is that, well, what kind of regime should we establish, right? Or what kind of regime should we establish when we talk about sort of that trilateral? Okay, I've worked on Korea issues as well, or Japan, US ROC trilat. Okay, I've been there, got traumatized, rehabilitated myself, and so forth. But now, for me personally, right? If we were talking about this a year ago, I still wouldn't have been so positive or optimistic about it. But now I am, right? At the same time, I feel that now is really the time to get something going and do something robust on this and establish something that's at least more sustainable, right now, before we lose this opportunity to do so, particularly when we have South Korea that is taking some various steps that we need to consider in some positive and negative ways, right? There are problems between Seoul and Tokyo, but still that especially when we think, again, I go back to that simultaneous contingency thing, because between Taiwan and Taiwan Straits and Korean Peninsula, because that's one of the main projects I'm working on right now, and I'm going to call you up on that. But when we think about that, that's where this trilat really counts, right? And something that even engaged with Taiwan, right? But US-Japan ROC trilat, this is going to be vital when we think about the Korean Peninsula and the Taiwan Straits. But what kind of regime should we have? How and why? That's always a question how we come back to, but how? I mean, and also, do you think we need some kind of regime, and what kind of regime do you have in mind if we had to make one?
Look, if I was sitting in Tokyo and I was looking at my near neighbors, right? You're looking at Russia, you're looking at North Korea, you're looking at China. You're not going to have good relations probably with any of those three in the near term, given the directions that those leaders are taking their countries. Then you've got Taiwan. You're not going to have an official relationship with Taiwan probably in the near future. And then you've got South Korea. So for me, when I would look around at Northeast Asia, I would say, I understand why the Korea-Japan relationship has been so difficult. Believe me, I've spent, as you know, a bit of time on this. But I also think there has to be a moment when we can get beyond some of these issues and just think about strategic interests. And if this isn't the moment when Russia, China, and North Korea are all posing new challenges, then there's not going to be a moment. So I think this is the time to be a little bit bold. So I'll put something bold on the table, which probably won't happen, but I think would be an opportunity, which is Prime Minister Kishida is hosting the G7. South Korea has found itself in a difficult position where it's not part of any of these major new minilateral groupings. It's not part of the G7. It's not part of Five Eyes. It's not part of the Quad, right? We could go on down the list. I think there's an opportunity to perhaps invite President Yoon to Hiroshima before the G7, have perhaps a trilateral leaders meeting to demonstrate that what China and North Korea and Russia are doing is driving these democracies closer together. Now, what is, that's sort of a political statement, right? But I think one lesson I've learned is we need that political statement to create space for bureaucrats in all of the countries to do the hard work on actually making the cooperation more substantive. So I think that would be a good political statement that perhaps would make it easier for us to do things like having an extended deterrence dialogue that could at times include, all three of those parties. So is that going to happen in May at the G7? Probably not. But I think it's an opportunity that folks in Tokyo have to think about seriously.
Yeah. And I think, again, like institutional, you talked at the point about sort of institutions, and I remember you tweeted, before about how the ROK is under institutionalized, right? And that sort of comes back to what you just said, right? And I think another thing is that, okay, institutionalizing things or establishing like a mechanism, that's great, but we also need to think about how, what that mechanism is going to be about. And when we think of that triad, again, if we think about the nature of the contingencies on the Korean Peninsula and Taiwan Strait, and the tasks and roles and priorities that the three of us have, that's where we also have to think about how we can coordinate the efforts, right, to make sure that, again, we are doing things more effectively and efficiently. When I think about US, Japan, ROK triad, I'm not always thinking about like these three forces, like, fighting, shoulder to shoulder against common enemy at the same time, right? It's about how we can coordinate our efforts so that we can focus on efficiency and effectiveness. So I agree. And I think there's a lot that we have to do, right? Particularly given the stress that we face today. And, we just have to really take some solid steps forward, but that has to start from now. Okay. Australia, we talked about that. Taiwan, some difficulties, but there could be some kind of communication that maybe we can think about. But that's always a tricky one, right? Taiwan. I mean, what we often talk about Taiwan, contingency in Taiwan Straits, but it's a shocking or surprising number of cases where we talk about Taiwan, but not with Taiwan, right? Whether it be governmental sort of stuff, but the challenge there are obvious. But even in sort of like, think tank meetings and also in academic ones, I mean, is that one problem that you find as well?
Yeah, I think increasingly we're going to have some real conversations, not just about Taiwan, but with Taiwan. And I don't think that violates, if we do it carefully, either of our approaches to the China-Taiwan issue. Now, again, there are some lines that we're probably going to avoid crossing, but look, there are lots of things that we can do in terms of having quiet conversations with Taiwan that I don't think create problems, especially if what we're doing is trying to have a better working level understanding about where we're going on Taiwan Strait issues. The US does a lot of cooperation with authorities in Taiwan. We just don't do it through official channels since 1979, but there's still lots of other things that we can and should be doing. And the same is, of course, true of Japan. So I do think there's room for some cooperation between the US and Japan and Taiwan. If nothing else, because look, the reality is if there's a major contingency around the Taiwan Strait, those are the three players that are most likely to be involved. And so in some ways, it would be sort of crazy if we weren't doing that kind of coordination now. So look, there's certainly some things we're probably not going to do. I don't think we're going to be involved in large-scale exercises with Taiwan and Japan and the United States around Taiwan. But that doesn't mean that we can't do other things, whether it be training or discussions about synchronizing, expectations about who would do what in a conflict, or even building up the capabilities of one party or another and making sure that we don't have too many seams and too many gaps. All of those kinds of things I think we can and should be doing now.
Yeah, definitely. Again, like, I hate to do so shameless self-promotion, but that's also another thing that I'm working on. It's like US, Japan, Taiwan, and also Korea. Some kind of mechanism, some kind of communication channel going on. And yeah, I'll be dragging you into that as well. And that one as well. So institutions, we often talk about some NATO-like institutions in Asia. I mean, just very quickly on this before we go into Q&A. I mean, we often do think about sort of these mega institutions of some kind, right? I mean, NATO is great, and Japan and Korea is engaging more with NATO, which there's a lot of positives on. But very quickly, do you think we need some kind of NATO-like multilateral mechanism or institution here in East Asia?
No.
I agree.
I think NATO worked in Europe in the Cold War for a specific reason, which is, really for three reasons, which is that especially in the middle of the Cold War, what you had was two blocks that were differentiated in multiple ways. They had different political systems. One was largely democratic. The other was basically communist. They had different economic systems, right? Because they were communist and capitalist. And then you also had a unifying threat that both of the blocs saw, which was the fight over Germany, right? At the inner German border. So that is just fundamentally different, in my view, than what exists in Asia now and what will exist in Asia in the future. Many of the countries that we need to cooperate with in Asia are not democratic, right? I think Vietnam's a key partner for the United States. The fact that it's not democratic and it's not capitalist, that's okay. And that's a big difference from the two, NATO Warsaw Pact bipolar dynamics that existed back in Europe during the Cold War. The other thing is that there is no unifying contingency that everyone in Asia worries about. We are talking a lot about Taiwan, but let's be honest, that if you were to ask most of the countries in Asia what contingency they worry most about, they'd give you a totally different answer. India would give you the Sino-Indian border, right? The Himalayas. Vietnam would probably give you the land border, or at least the maritime border in the paracels with China. The Philippines would give you the Spratly Islands. Taiwan would give you the Taiwan Strait. Japan would probably give you East China Sea and maybe Taiwan increasingly. South Korea would talk about North Korea, right? Australia and New Zealand would talk about the Pacific Islands and on down the list. So there is no unifying alliance, I think, that you could even imagine in Asia, because the countries are too different and the scenarios they're worried about are far different. So what's going to happen? My view is that what we're seeing is sort of the rise of coalitions, right? Of minilateral groupings. And that best you can hope for is to have a small group of countries that have similar interests on a specific issue, and that those countries come together and try and accomplish something specific. So, for example, semiconductor supply chains. Which countries are most critical about that issue in Asia? Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, US. Well, that's the Chip 4 alliance, right? What countries are, big players that are democratic and worried about China and rules and norms? Well, Japan, the United States, Australia, India. Those countries have the Quad, right? I think increasingly what we're seeing is these new minilateral groupings emerge and take over bigger roles. Because the older multilateral institutions, including ASEAN, don't seem to be delivering. And so I don't think we're going to see an Asian NATO. I don't think it's possible. I'm not sure it would be helpful. But what I do think we're going to see is these more flexible coalitions on different issue sets. And just last thought on this, which is that I think this is where the US and Japan are in a really great spot, because our interests are so similar that, I could make an argument that Japan is the only country that's part of all of the coalitions that the US has that it's sort of building right now. On security issues, I think the Quad is playing a leading role in Asia, right? On economic issues, the G7 is playing a leading role. On technology issues, the Chip 4 grouping is leading. And on sort of global governance and democracy issues, the US and Japan are doing a lot, right? So across all of these issue sets, Japan and the US are really closely aligned, probably more closely aligned than any two countries elsewhere around the world, which means that Japan's not just critical to those groupings, Japan is critical to working with the US to figure out how to build these coalitions in different issue sets. And so I think that puts Japan sort of in the driver's seat for what this new institutional arrangement in Asia is going to look like.
Yeah, and I totally agree. I think that flexibility, we have a lot of things where, in a lot of aspects, we're aligned. And although we don't have an institution like NATO, again, like as you said, what works over there doesn't necessarily mean it works over here, right? We have to have the right prescriptions, according to particular prompts, right? It's that context about so being specific, and so I think it seems like things are weaker without an institution like NATO. At the same time, that also means that we have the advantage of being flexible. And I think that's really good when it comes to East Asia. Now, okay, so I've been waiting on some questions. There are one or two more. For anyone that has any questions, now that we are gearing to the last 30, 15 minutes or so, please send them in as soon as possible. And we actually answered about 3 or 4 questions anyhow already. But there's one that has just come up. Okay, in case of Taiwan contingency, what do you think will be the reaction or response from Australia or European? So I'm guessing like NATO states in this case. And how should Japan and the United States work with those countries? Now, Australia is part of that alliance network here in the Indo-Pacific, but what NATO? Any thoughts on that?
I have a lot of thoughts on this. I've written a little bit, and I'll be a bit provocative here, which is to say that I am not sure how active the Europeans or Australia would be in terms of military contributions in a Taiwan contingency, which is not to say that they wouldn't do anything. I think for sure there would be talk about, perhaps adding frigates or destroyers to a task force somewhere in the Western Pacific. But I think if you're talking about really substantial fighting forces, my guess is that the bulk of those are going to come from the United States and from Japan and from Taiwan. And that does not mean, however, that Europe or Australia or India or others are unimportant, right? I think, for example, there would have to be unity diplomatically to push back against China. There would have to be unity on economic sanctions and some penalties for China taking military action against Taiwan. That would require a huge amount of work and sacrifice from Europe, from others. But my expectation, right, is that if we're talking about countries that can't just contribute one ship or 1 or 2 assets to a contingency, but that are able to provide dozens, that's a really small number of countries, right? There are a small number of countries that would be willing, and there are a small number of countries that are able. And, we also talked a couple minutes ago about the need to be prepared for multiple challenges at the same time. And it wouldn't at all surprise me if, Korea was tied down on the Korean Peninsula and the Europeans were tied down in Europe trying to deal with challenges in those regions at the same time. And that would be a critical role for each of those players to play. So would there be roles for Australia, for Europe, for others on the military side? Of course there could be. But I think our expectation in the US-Japan alliance is that we need to be prepared so that we're not reliant on those contributions, but we're reliant on ourselves to bring to bear the capabilities we would need in that scenario. And then if we do get additional assistance, that is an additional win, that's a success, but we can't just assume that that's going to be there in a contingency.
Yeah, I don't think you're being provocative at all. I think you're being very realistic, right? On this is that, and that I also feel that the US and Japan has to be at the nucleus of all of this, right? In the end, and that unless we have to make sure that we can do things right, and that because otherwise it's really not going to mean much, right? If we are not doing the right thing and depending on others, as you just said, right? And this doesn't just apply to Taiwan, Taiwan Straits, but also elsewhere, right? Whether it be South China Sea or this whole thing that, free and open Indo-Pacific as well, right? Also, another thing about free and open Indo-Pacific is that we often, don't address enough about the Pacific Islands. I think that's where also Japan and the United States can do a lot more on. Again, I'm going back to your net assessment podcast that, the Pacific Island is a critical area. And we learn the consequences of not paying enough attention to that area with what happened over in Solomon Islands, right? That's something that we could have addressed or prevented a long, long time ago. And so, again, we go back to the thing about prioritization. Okay. Before I go on, again, if anyone has any questions, please put it out. This is really your last chance. But we have to get that. Get that prioritization right. It's not about saying, right, we've just focused on this and not focused on the rest. It's really about getting in order and saying, right, we do this. If we don't get this right, well, then all the others are going to fail. So I think that's something that we do need to think about. But the developments going on between Japan and South Korea and NATO is quite interesting, right? What do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree with you on that prioritization point, right? And I think what we need to see is from an American perspective, so ideally we would see the Pacific Islands united and strong together. And I think, if you look at just even the last few months, we've seen really positive movement from the Pacific Islands, right? As a group, right? They've come together to welcome Kiribati back into the PIF, which now has a new leader. We're going to see them, I think, in a pretty healthy spot, which is united. And that's good for the US and Japan, right? We want strong countries in Asia, right? They're not challenges to us. We want strong, independent countries that follow rules and work together to do so. So if the PIF is working, if the Pacific Islands are strong and united, that's great for us. Just the same way it would be if in Southeast Asia, if ASEAN was strong and united and effective. But where that's not happening, like in Southeast Asia, I think we're not going to be able to make the same kind of bets that we can on a regional institution. We're going to have to make some bets on countries. So for me, one area where I'd like to see the US and maybe Japan put more effort is Indonesia. I just think if you look at the basic demographic realities in Asia, they're not great in a lot of the region, right? In Japan and South Korea and Taiwan and China, demographics are really ugly. Look at Indonesia, huge population, growing population, right? It is going to be, I think, an engine looking forward decades and decades, just the same way that India will be. So for me, when I think about where we should be prioritizing that maybe we're not, Indonesia would be, maybe at the top of my list, if not pretty close to it, which doesn't mean that it's going to be easy, right? Indonesia sees its interests as very different from those of the US and Japan, and that's okay, right? We have tolerated with India, for example, India having different interests from ours, and that's been okay. And we can still find ways to work together. And I think we probably need to be doing that same thing with Indonesia as well.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. So Indonesia, definitely I agree with you on that. also say Philippines, Vietnam,
Mhm.
and I can give you a whole list. But also another critical one might be Singapore as well. Although I'm being a little bit subjective there, but Singapore, given their location and also some of the work that we've done with Singapore, and that's also something that we have to think about. Like not just in terms of defense cooperation, but also some of the dialogues that are held there and so forth. There's all the things that Singapore facilitates that we have to think about. Now, very, very quickly, I'm going to be in lightning mode because of time. Okay, so I've got two more questions, very quick ones. One, Taiwan military. Okay, should they focus more on the asymmetric side, asymmetric aspects, or do we need to fundamentally change the Taiwanese military? Now they've just shifted back to national service. That's a really big commitment. But any comments on that? Very quick comments.
Yeah, I'll give you a quick version of a much longer argument,
Yep.
which is yes, Taiwan should primarily think about asymmetric capabilities, but I don't think that means that Taiwan can only have asymmetric capabilities, because asymmetry might be really effective in pushing back against a invasion of Taiwan, right? If you have enough anti-ship missiles, they can sink a lot of invading amphibious vessels. Great. But there are other scenarios like a blockade or a seizure of an outlying island that are going to require Taiwan to have some other capabilities. And I think the hard thing for us is to think through what the right mix of symmetric and asymmetric capabilities are, and whether there are some symmetrical capabilities that we don't want Taiwan to have, but where the US might have to supply those capabilities and have an understanding with Taiwan that we're going to incentivize Taiwan to invest in certain asymmetric capabilities, and we will provide other enablers in other types of contingencies. Right now, I don't think we have that level of understanding with Taiwan, and they probably don't have the confidence that they can rely on us. But I think that's the kind of discussion that we will need to have in the next few years.
Definitely. Also, somewhat similar to that, again, very quickly, Japan strengthening its defense posture, strategies and readiness, sharpening and strengthening its defense strategies and readiness. What is, from your point of view, the top priority that Japan should do in terms of doing that?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that I think we've got to make top priorities, but let me just give you two very quick ones. So one is that I think we need to be very focused on the Southwest Islands, and in particular, the southernmost. So Yonaguni, Ishigaki, and Miyako. Let's be honest, if we are in a major contingency over Taiwan, we're going to be very focused on that part of Japan. And so I would like to see us move towards having not just more facility access for the JSDF and for potentially US military forces, but eventually moving towards some joint use of bases, not just in Okinawa, but down through other parts of the Ryukyus. So that would be, one quick priority. The other big one for me is command and control arrangements. Yeah. So we are seeing Japan stand up a permanent joint headquarters, which I think is a positive sign. But I do not think we are ready today to command and control a major contingency that involves both American and Japanese forces, especially in a China contingency. That is just not what we've prepared for. Look, in the NATO alliance, in the US-South Korea alliance, we have combined commands. That may not be legally or politically possible in Japan, but I would like to see us move towards at least having parallel command structures and maybe some co-located commands. And that is not where we are today. So I think that's another area where we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, definitely. And so I think there's a lot, again, we can talk about counterstrike, but I'm thinking also about air naval defense, particularly with the use of asymmetric strategies and operations, but joint command and also coordinated command, that's also very critical here as well. Okay, so I think we answered, the key critical questions. There was also another question about simultaneous conflict, but that's something that we are going to have to talk about in next round and write more on, because this is really an idea that's in development. So, stay tuned for that one. Okay, so we've now reached the end of the session. And I think, Zack has given us a lot of things to chew on, for Japan, but also from, the Japan-US alliance perspective. There's been a lot of some positive developments in the alliance, yet, the threats and challenges are also growing a lot as well. And so going forward, we do have to work on a lot of stuff. But yeah, and a lot of things that we can talk about in future rounds between you and me, and also in different settings. But Zach, thank you very much once again. I'm sure we'll be working together again very soon. And yeah, so thanks for coming along.
Well, thank you so much, Rio. It's wonderful to get a chance to see you again and to have a discussion with so many friends on the line. And thanks also to the University of Tokyo, of course, as well.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so that's it for this session. Thank you all for joining us today here, Rose, and we'll be bringing you more events soon. And to think more about some of the many challenges that we face, for us here in Japan, but also with our allies and like-minded states. And think about the steps that need to be taken to take on those challenges. So thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you again soon. In the meantime, take care and wish you all the best.